Begin by saying that this conference is funded by the John Templeton Foundation. My colleague John Greco and I are the recipients of a very generous grant from the Templeton Foundation for a project on the philosophy and theology of intellectual humility. John can't be here today because there's a medical emergency in his family. He's on the East Coast and he won't be able to be with us this week. But he's very much part of this project, and we're sorry not to have him with us today. So I need also to thank our Templeton team, Krista Hyde and Matt Shea, Jim McCullum, John Reedseman, Ian Church, and Josh Johnson especially, who had the major responsibility for the work of this grant. Very grateful to our superb team and all the work they did to make this conference possible and to help it go smoothly. So we're glad that you're here. The point of this conference is to help us do something, not to be parochial. So when we think about the virtues and the vices in philosophy, we do tend to think about them from a Christian point of view with a Christian background. Now, I am Christian myself and I like the Christian background, but I do think it is necessary to make sure we don't get mixed up and think that background is all there is to thinking about humility, intellectual humility, or ordinary moral humility. So in an effort to help us at least have some mindfulness about other traditions in the monotheistic world, we have today speakers who will help us think about humility from the point of view of the Islamic tradition and the Jewish tradition. So our first speaker today is John McGinnis. John received his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. He's now professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis, so he's one of our precious resources in the city, and that's very nice for us. He's done a lot of work on the translation of Islamic sources to make them available for those of us who don't read the original languages. He has an anthology on classic Arabic philosophy with Hackett Publishing in 2009, another translation of Avicenna's work, The Physics of Healing, also in 2009, and in 2010 a major work on Avicenna from Oxford University Press. He's also the recipient of numerous honors and awards, too many to mention here, but among them he has had several grants from the National Endowment of the Humanities. He's had a Fulbright scholarship to Egypt. He's been visiting fellow at Harvard University, and there are many more of the same sort. Today he's going to talk to us on this topic. It's hard to be humble, intellectual humility, and perfection in medieval Islam. So with that, let's welcome John McGinnis.
Thank you very much. I'm worried this is going to be a... Can you guys hear me? Because it looks like it's a sync that's going to echo back and forth here, but no, it's good. First, I want to thank the all the folks on the Intellectual Humility Project for just making this happen, arranging breakfast, all of those good things. I appreciate that very much. And let me begin by just saying, first off, this paper I'm reading now is about 3 iterations from the paper I originally thought I was going to do. So it's not hard to be humble. Well, it's an old Mac Davis song, but it's not going to be as much on perfection as it's going to be on humility, hopefully. So before beginning, let me provide a caveat. I'm neither a Muslim nor an ethicist. In fact, I'm not even a student of Islamic philosophy, Islamic religion per se. Rather, I'm an expert in Arabic philosophy as it was practiced in the Neoplatonizing Aristotelian tradition of the classical period, about 850 to 1200, a tradition known as Falsafa. I'm also interested in how Falsafa influenced Islamic philosophical theology, what is known in Arabic as the science of Kalam. Thus, be forewarned that I'm not about to make claims concerning what Muslims today might say about the Islamic conception of humility generally, nor intellectual humility more specifically. Rather, I'm limiting myself primarily to what Muslim philosophers and theologians during the classical period of Islam had to say about these and other related topics. Now, despite the limited preview of my remarks, the Falsafa and Kalam traditions were indeed formative in the development of Islamic philosophical theology, as seen in such major orthodox Sunni and Shia theologians as, for example, Al-Ghazali, we'll talk about him, Fakhruddin al-Razi, Nasiruddin Tusi, the great Shia theologian. And thus the impact of these historical traditions, Falsafa and Kalam, can still be felt today. Hence, there is value in seeing what a relatively small but historically significant group of Muslim intellectuals had to say about humility, particularly as applied in an epistemic context. Okay, to begin. I take it that one of the primary goals, if not the primary goal of this workshop, is not to see whether non-Anglo-European cultures share with us some preconceived idea of humility, but rather to see how these other cultures view humility on their own terms, and whether those other cultures' views differ from our own, or at least are nuanced in distinctive ways. Such a goal has the potential advantage of highlighting our own preconceptions, and even perhaps offers us an opportunity to show some intellectual humility when considering a culture and time quite separate from our own. So let me begin with two potential preconceptions that we today might unreflectively assume when considering the notion of the Islamic virtue of humility or intellectual humility. Now, the first assumption is that humility is in fact a virtue. Interestingly, the Arabic term for humility, tawadia, does not appear in the Quran at all. Now, this observation is not to suggest that the Quran is silent on the subject of humility. Still, if one's gut instinct is that the subject of humility should be treated in the Quran, and its absence would somehow be a flaw, one probably is doing so on the preconception that humility must be a virtue. During the course of this presentation, I consider some influential thinkers who questioned whether humility is a virtue and their reasons for doing so. All of this is to say that we today in the West readily accept that humility is a virtue, but whether it in fact is requires some account of what a virtue is and some recognition of what does and does not count as humility. A second assumption, which we might bring to the table unaware, is that there is some single unique thing, the Islamic virtue of humility. The fact is that there were many distinct accounts of humility among medieval Islamic philosophers and theologians. The diversity in part results from an attempt to synthesize elements of Greek ethical theory and the morality of the Abrahamic traditions. Now, in this regard, it is important to note that Falsafa is not merely a continuation of Hellenistic philosophy. Rather, it is a fusion of the Greek sciences and the culture and religious influences of the Eastern Mediterranean world. While the primary religious influence was obviously Islam on Falsafa, one must never lose sight of the fact that Muslims did not view their religion as a new one, but as the completion and perfection of Judaism and Christianity. Thus, differences about the importance and nature of humility arise depending on what elements, whether they be Greek, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, that are being emphasized in one's account. Now, in order to avoid these and other potential biases, I propose first to outline the general Falsafa theory about the nature of virtue. For in order to see whether humility is an instance of virtue, one must first understand how the notion of virtue is being used. As we shall see, Platonic and Aristotelian accounts of the virtues provided the general theoretical framework for medieval Arabic works on ethics. Second, I consider the various ancient Greek attitudes towards humility, which inform the attitudes of the medieval Muslim world. What we see is that a tension existed between Greek philosophers, particularly Plato and Aristotle, and Christian scriptures concerning the moral status of humility. Third, I take up various accounts of humility found among medieval Muslim intellectuals. I particularly focus on the view of the philosophers Avicenna, are the philosopher Avicenna and the theologian El-Ghazali. Fourth and finally, based upon these accounts and how they differ from one another, and even perhaps from our own conception of humility, I identify no less than two distinct dimensions at play in a theory of intellectual humility. One element concerns the intellectual content of beliefs, while the other involves individuals' various intellectual capacities. My glasses are dirty, and so I'm having problems reading here, so bear with me. Okay. And if you're, by the way, as soon as I take off my glasses, this is an impressionistic painting, worthy of Monet. Okay, so the first task, the medieval Islamic philosopher's account of virtue. The Arabic word for virtue is fadla, which, like the Greek term arete and even the English word virtue, can signify both a moral character as well as, more generally, any excellence. Now, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle formally defines the moral sense of virtue as, quote, a state that chooses which is found in the mean that is relative to us as defined by reason, end quote. By the way, if my translations of Aristotle sometimes seem a little off, it's because I'm translating from the Arabic translation, so this is how they would have understood it. Turns out the Arabic is actually a little bit clearer than the Greek. So in this case, philosophers in the medieval Islamic world understood this state that is identified with virtue in reference to how one responds to the urges and desires of one or another of three psychological faculties. The psychological faculties are the concupiscent faculty, which gives rise to the desire for food, drink, sex, and other bodily appetites. The irascible faculty, which explains the emotions of anger and fear, and so our urges for fight or flight. And finally, the rational faculty, which might further be divided into the theoretical reason and practical reason, which clearly are related to the intellectual virtues. Now, according to many Muslim philosophers, associated with one or more of these psychological faculties are the four cardinal virtues: temperance, courage, wisdom, and justice. Temperance indicates a type of moderation with respect to the desires of the concupiscent faculty. Courage involves an intermediate response to the emotions of the irascible faculty. And wisdom concerns the activities of the rational faculty. As for justice, some philosophers, more sympathetic to Plato, viewed it as harmony and proper balance among all three faculties, while others, drawing on the Aristotelian tradition, identified the virtue of while drawing on the Aristotelian distinction between theoretical and practical reasoning, identified the virtue of wisdom specifically with theoretical reasoning, and then justice with practical reasoning. Now, whatever the case, most Muslim philosophers were convinced that any adequate account of virtue must be embedded within one's moral psychology. So it's this general Platonic Aristotelian moral psychology that's informing what they're going to be doing. Now, additionally, many ethicists in medieval Islamic world viewed these four cardinal virtues, again, temperance, courage, wisdom, and justice, as the highest genre of genera of virtuous activities, with various species of virtues falling under each of these cardinal virtues. Now, while there was general agreement about these four generic cardinal virtues, there was much more diversity over the list of the species of virtues that fall under each of these cardinal virtues. So the idea is you got these four moral genus: courage, wisdom, temperance, and justice, and then you get various species that can be defined by finding some sort of differentia. Now, the diversity of opinions extended not only to which character trait should be included on the list, so sometimes some group thought one thing was a virtue, other folks would not consider it a virtue, but it also considered which genus a given species of virtue should fall. So, as an example, consider sedateness, which, to the best of my ability to understand, is the quality of being the strong, silent type. Probably most of us wouldn't even consider that a virtue, but it does tend to be discussed quite a bit in the Arabic world. So, thus, the ethicist and historian Ibn Miskawayh, who dies around 1030, in his refinement of moral character, places sedateness under the virtue of temperance. El-Ghazali, in The Balance of Practice, classifies sedateness as a species of courage, whereas Avicenna does not mention sedateness at all in his ethics. As we shall see, debates of the same nature also surrounded humility. For now, I merely want to observe that Muslim ethicists had an entire system for classifying species of virtues, and that those taxonomies were not set, but subject to substantive revision and discussion. Now, before looking at the Muslim account of humility, I first want to consider the attitudes of ancient Greeks towards humility in order to provide an historical context. Now, no less than two almost diametrically opposed views of humility appear in the classical and Hellenistic world. That of the Christians and that of pagan philosophers. The Christian attitude towards humility was decidedly a positive one. Christian scriptures characterize humility not only as pleasing to God, but also perhaps as even typifying divinity itself, as seen in the God-man Jesus Christ. Thus, for example, one reads at 1 Peter 5:5, quote, "God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble," end quote. Humility in this verse is clearly presented as the virtue opposing pride, as well as being a virtue that God rewards. Indicating the divine aspect of humility, Paul tells us in Philippians 2:8, quote, "He, Jesus, humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross," end quote. Now, since for Christians Jesus represents not only the exemplar of morally upstanding behavior, but also the divinity itself, Paul is exhorting us to imitate Jesus' humility precisely because it is a virtue that God exhibits. Now, examples from Christian scriptures revealing this attitude about moral value of humility could be extended quite, extensively. So, the upshot of all this, humility for Christians is clearly a virtue. Now, the term for humility in all the verses just cited, and by far the preferred Greek term for humility throughout Christian scriptures, is tapanates, or at least something etymologically linked to tapanates. Furthermore, tapanates frequently underlies the Septuagint's Greek translation of the Hebrew anava in Jewish scriptures. And this term can be rendered as either humility or affliction. Now, in classical Greek, tapanates literally means lowness or being lowly. Thus, Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle usually take this term and its derivatives in a morally negative sense, indicating someone who is base, mean, vile, or, in its most positive use, of humble origins. So, for example, Plato in The Statesman 309a uses the term to describe those who are not among the noble and kingly, and as such have no share in what, quote, belongs to the sphere of virtue, end quote. Similarly, in Aristotle's Rhetorics 2:6, he joins and in effect identifies the qualities of tapanates with micropsychia, literally smallness of soul. Now, to get a sense then of how Aristotle viewed humility, consider his extended remarks about smallness of soul in Nicomachean Ethics 3:3. In that work, Aristotle makes smallness of soul the vice of deficiency that contrasts with the virtue of magnanimity, megalopsychia. Arabic kibra nafs, literally greatness of soul. Now, the virtue of magnanimity, claims Aristotle, is a mean between, on the one hand, elevating oneself beyond what one deserves, an excess, and, on the other hand, not elevating oneself to one's deserved level, that is, being small-souled and humbling oneself. A defect, says Aristotle. Aristotle even goes on to claim that being small-souled and humbling oneself reflects a more vicious moral state than magnanimity's other extreme, vanity or conceit. Now, my intent here is not to defend nor criticize Aristotle's conception of magnanimity. I merely note that this Aristotelian virtue, seen in one light, certainly appears opposed to Christian humility as a virtue. Consequently, the Felsefa tradition, which was heir both to Greek philosophy and the Judeo-Christian religious tradition, inherited a set of views about humility that were, at least I think, in decided tension with one another. Now, I return to the medieval Islamic world and consider the language of humility as it, I now return to the medieval Islamic world and consider the language of humility as it occurs in Arabic. Now, as mentioned earlier, the Greek term most commonly translated as humility in Christian scriptures is tapanates. Now, from the earliest Arabic translation of Christian scriptures, this Greek term is consistently and just always translated by the Arabic tawadia. Now, as with other Semitic languages, Arabic uses a root system where typically some triliteral root provides the word's base meaning. Additional terms are then derived from this root by adding various orthographic features. The root of tawadia, waw, dad, ein, has as its base meaning to place or to set something down. Tawadia is the transitive reflexive derivation of this base root, and so it literally means to bring oneself down or low. So it does capture at least some of the sense of what we mean by humility. Additionally, however, the sixth form of an Arabic verb, this transitive reflexive sense of which tawadia is an instance, can imply that one does the action of the root verb to oneself for one's own good. Thus, tawadia can mean to lower oneself in a way that may benefit the individual. Now, it's likely because of this latter good-making sense of tawadia that the Arabic translator of the Nicomachean Ethics also chose that term, tawadia, to translate Aristotle's use of metreion. Now, the Greek term metreion literally means being within proper measure, and in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics has the sense of modesty. Moreover, Aristotle introduces the virtue of modesty when he discusses the virtue that is opposed to the vice of pride and is associated with moderate honors. Thus, owing to this translator's choice of terms, the Christian virtue of humility came to be associated with the Aristotelian virtue of modesty. Not humility, but modesty. And so relieving some of the tension noted in the previous section. Now, in addition to this historical accident, Christian philosophers working within the Philosopha tradition movement also took steps to reconcile the Greek philosophical tradition and Christian scriptures concerning humility. For example, the Syrian Orthodox Christian Yahya ibn Adi, dies 974, in his work, The Refinement of Moral Character, has this to say about humility, and I quote, "Humility is to stop trying to be leader, but to display a low profile and antipathy towards aggrandizement and increasing honors. The fact is that the humble person puts to one side boasting about what is excellent in himself and bragging about his rank and money. He is on guard against arrogance and pride. Humility exists only in people of high rank, their leaders, and the virtuous and knowledgeable. Folks other than these are not being humble because, well, lowliness is their place in rank, and so they're not feigning it. So you've got to be better than anybody else in order to be humble." This guy. Okay. While the first part of Ibn Adi's discussion should sound familiar enough, it is the latter part that is worth noting. Here, he emphasizes that a necessary condition for humility is that one be in a position of power or superiority. If one is not in such a position, well, then presenting oneself as lowly is not an instance of humility, at least according to Ibn Adi. Here, Ibn Adi may be thinking of either the example of Jesus Christ or of Plato's nobleman and Aristotle's magnanimous man. Whichever case he has in mind, Ibn Adi certainly wants to show that humility is a virtue that is perfectly compatible with honor, nobility, high standing, provided one is not also vain and glorious. So that's the medieval Christian account in the Arabic world by Ibn Adi. So, what about Muslim philosophers? I've done a lot of philology and history, so I'll get into the meat of it here. How did they view humility? There were a wide variety of attitudes among Muslim intellectuals concerning humility. While Ibn Miskawayh had nothing to say about humility in his highly influential work on ethics, The Refinement of Moral Characters. And by the way, this is like the most important work on ethics out there, and humility doesn't even show up in it. So that already says something. Despite this lack, certainly many of the other big names of Islamic philosophy and theology, like Al-Farabi, who dies in 950, Avicenna, who dies in 1037, Al-Ghazali, with a memorable death date of 1111, and Nasiruddin Tusi, 1274, did discuss humility as a virtue. Sometimes the discussions were brief, merely mentioning that humility is a virtue and then providing some form of definition or description. Thus, for instance, Al-Farabi, who was a teacher and associate of the Christian philosopher Yahya ibn Adi, identifies humility in his work, The Aphorism of the Statesman, with, quote, a moral character intermediate between being proud on the one side and being vulgar and sheepish on the other, end quote. Here, Al-Farabi is methodologically following Aristotle, who characterizes virtues in terms of a mean between vices. In contrast, the great Shiite philosopher and theologian Nasiruddin Tusi defines humility in terms of a genus in difference. Thus, according to him, humility falls under the genus of courage and has as its difference that, quote, it assigns itself no merit over those lower in station, end quote. In other words, according to Tusi, humility is that species of courage that does not fear others thinking lower of one than one's actual merits deserve. Now, Avicenna provides a fuller account of humility, albeit his discussion is terse and needs to be unpacked. In his treatise, The Science of Ethics, Avicenna classifies humility not as a species of courage, as Tusi would do later, but as a virtue that falls under the genus of wisdom. He argues for this classification by noting that humility requires discernment, and discernment belongs to the faculty of reason. And again, the cardinal virtue of wisdom is understood by reference to this faculty of reason. Avicenna then goes on to describe humility thus, and I'll quote, humility is to restrain one's innate knowledge endowed upon humans by God concerning the feeble, weak, and inferior character of someone who seeks to elevate himself above his equals and exalt himself over one of them through some particular spectacular show of excellence, whether bodily or mentally, end quote. I actually kind of like this guy. So there are a number of points worth noting and developing about Avicenna's account of humility. First, Avicenna defines humility in terms of a genus in difference rather than solely in terms of a mean between two vices. Now again, for Avicenna, humility's genus is wisdom, while the specific difference is discernment in the form of a type of self-knowledge. Specifically, one knows that one is better than someone else, and yet does not act upon that knowledge so as to humiliate the inferior person. An example might be a teacher who is confronted by an overly zealous student, where the student presents an idea as if it's groundbreaking, world-changing, or the like, when in fact the idea is, well, not. Second, like Ibn Adi before him, Avicenna makes being superior to another, and indeed recognizing that superiority, a necessary condition for humility. Here, a brief note on Avicenna's Arabic and an aside on how his audience would have understood his meaning will make this second point much stronger. Avicenna uses the Arabic passive verb futira, to be endowed by God, and the etymologically linked fitra, innate character, when speaking of one's knowledge of self-superiority. Now, these terms would have made it amply clear to those in Avicenna's own historical and cultural milieu that the humble person must be inherently and by nature superior to the other person. On this point, let me linger. Most philosophers in the Felsefa tradition recognized a natural intellectual hierarchy among humans. Indeed, the only philosopher from this period who I know who rejected a hierarchy of grades in natural intelligence was the freethinker Muhammad bin Zakaria al-Razi, who dies in 925, who did so as part of his criticism of the need for scripture. He says all humans are equally intelligent. They can, I can figure out all this stuff without the need of scripture. You guys can too. But that was, as I said, the exception. Most believed in this natural hierarchy. And so this intellectual hierarchy consisted of no less than 3 grades of humans, defined by reference to what sort of proof one finds convincing. In fact, some figures had 4 grades, saying that humans aren't even a single species, it's a genus. So there's the hoi polloi, that's us, and then there's the prophets, who are literally a different species of human. So some of them will even be that extreme. But that's, again, these are the sort of extreme views. Most identify only 3 grades of humans, defined by reference to what sort of proofs one finds convincing. So the lowest class of humans, then, is that of those who find rhetorical arguments convincing, with their appeal to images and emotions. The next class up is those who are persuaded by dialectical arguments. That is, arguments whose premises, while highly probable, are not in fact absolutely necessary. Above the dialectic class, there is the demonstrative class, which consists of philosophers, sages, and prophets. Philosophers on this classification are defined as those who are convinced by demonstrations, where a demonstration is understood in the sense explained by Aristotle in the Posterior Analytics, namely a logically valid argument that proceeds from purportedly necessary first principles. Now, Avicenna's appeal to this intellectual hierarchy in his account of humility I take to be radically opposed to what many of us today might believe about humility. For I take it that many of us are predisposed towards some form of egalitarianism. While one might know more than another, the superiority is often viewed as being due to one's efforts or nurture, and not because one is inherently and by nature intellectually better than others. Whatever one might think about Avicenna's condition on intellectual humility, it represents an important point in his account. Now, a third aspect of Avicenna's conception of humility is that it requires a response to another. Now, this point, in fact, can be generalized, since important medieval Muslim ethicists, again like Ibn Miskawayh, argued that all virtues require interaction with others, other humans specifically. Thus, the hermit who lives in isolation from society, or the scholar who stays locked up in his study, cannot be virtuous, and at best are merely amoral, again, according to a certain tradition within the Islamic ethical tradition here. Now, Avicenna humility is specifically a response to a vice in another. Namely, it is how one treats someone who is acting either arrogantly or who has wrongly assessed his or her own merit. In either case, the humble person is responding to someone who has made a mistake in discernment, namely someone who thinks either too highly of himself or herself, or even not highly enough. In short, for Avicenna, humility essentially involves a certain social dimension. It is always a response to another human. Now, I say more about intellectual humility in Avicenna when I compare him with Al-Ghazali, but for now, let me just make 2 brief observations. First, intellectual humility for Avicenna demands a fair self-assessment of one's intellectual abilities. Such a self-assessment must not only avoid ascribing a greater status to one's intellectual abilities than one merits, but also not underestimating one's abilities. For in this latter case, namely underevaluating one's abilities, one may in fact endorse or encourage someone else's bad idea, rather than patiently listening and then helping that other person develop or improve the idea. Second, Avicennan intellectual humility is not a factor in one's own acquisition of knowledge. Rather, it plays a role only in how one responds to another who lacks the same degree of knowledge as oneself. Now, such a position does not deny that the intellectually humble person should learn from others who are one's intellectual superiors. Still, Avicenna would not classify such an attitude. Avicenna would classify such an attitude not as intellectual humility, but as perhaps intellectual modesty, namely the fear of holding a wrong or inferior set of beliefs. Now again, I say more about Avicenna and intellectual humility when I compare his account with that of Al-Ghazali, to whom I now turn. Now, Al-Ghazali discusses the virtues in a number of works. Of these, his treatise Balance of Practice is the closest to a straightforward work on ethics. While in that text, humility is not explicitly listed as a virtue. El-Ghazali does intimately and explicitly associate humility with the virtue of sedateness, that being the strong and silent type that we talked about earlier, which, according to El-Ghazali, is a species of courage. Now, in that discussion, he suggests that humility is of two kinds, one blameworthy, the other commendable. Thus, in order to contextualize El-Ghazali's conception of humility, I first consider his account of courage, of which humility is a species, and then his distinction between vicious and virtuous humility. Now, courage in El-Ghazali is an Islamic twist on Aristotle's account of courage, Andres, or Arabic shaja'a, as it's found in Nicomachean Ethics 3:6. Aristotle observes that courage, so this is Aristotle, observes that courage is concerned with how one responds to fear, and not just any fear, but what is most frightening. Aristotle then identifies the most frightening thing with death, for he argues, quote, there seems to be nothing good or bad for the dead, end quote. He then adds that the circumstances in which one stands up to one's fears must also be taken into account, for it is not how one faces any death, maintains Aristotle, but how one faces one's fear of death in war that most fittingly is courage. Now, El-Ghazali agrees with Aristotle that courage is a response to what is fearful. However, he disagrees with Aristotle that the most frightening thing is death. Instead, contends El-Ghazali, the most frightening thing is God, and the possibility of eternal damnation and separation from God in the afterlife. Thus, courage involves a response to an awful and fearful God, and a realization that any other fears should pale by comparison. Similarly, El-Ghazali agrees with Aristotle that courage is most fittingly displayed in war. However, he again modifies this Aristotelian claim in light of Islamic doctrine. For El-Ghazali understands war as jihad, that is, holy war, which has as its base meaning the term jihad, to strive. Now, drawing upon a prophetic tradition, a hadith, El-Ghazali further distinguishes between a greater striving, or jihad, al-jihad al-akbar, and a lesser striving, or jihad, al-jihad al-asghar. Now, the lesser jihad is a Muslim's armed conflict or battle with unbelievers so as to spread Islam, whereas the greater jihad, according to El-Ghazali, is one striving or warring against one's bodily desires in order to draw closer to God. Now, in this vein, El-Ghazali even goes so far as to deny the traditional Muslim view that martyrs hold the most exalted positions in heaven. In their stead, El-Ghazali rather places the learned man, the ulama, who have won the battle against their bodily desires so as to put a desire for God, for knowing God above all else. The primary sense of courage for El-Ghazali then is, and I quote, the soul's resistance to blameworthy fear and aspiration for the sake of the word of God Most High, end quote. Now, as for humility, El-Ghazali initially introduces it as a vice, so he saw it as a vice, associated with one of the species of courage, namely sedateness. For he tells us sedateness is a mean between the vices of arrogance and humility. Now, in the same discussion, however, El-Ghazali also identifies a commendable sense of humility. In order to distinguish the commendable from the vicious sense of humility, consider the following two scenarios. In one, an individual is constantly putting himself down and engaging in self-deprecation, and doing so in a public way. Saying, for instance, I'm just so stupid, or I'm not worthy, etc. Such a person may really but incorrectly believe these things about him or herself, and so is guilty of not being self-honest. Or he may also be acting so as to provoke a response from us. No, you really are smart. Or perhaps a person just wants us to believe that he's humble and so a virtuous person. This external and vocal show of humility, regardless of the motivation, seems to be El-Ghazali's vicious sense of humility. Alternatively, one's evaluation of one's merit may be entirely internal and not open for public consumption, as it were. In this case, one attempts to assess one's position accurately vis-a-vis the various contexts of one's life. Ultimately, for Al-Ghazali, such examination leads to an appreciation of our place in the cosmos and our status relative to God. Of course, compared with God, we really are lowly, and there simply is no room on our part for arrogance, Al-Ghazali tells us. In his short religious manual, The Beginning of Guidance, Al-Ghazali explains how such a reflection on our position relative to God should purge us of arrogance, both toward God and those around us. And he advises Muslims thus. This is a somewhat long quote, but I think it's a really nice quote, so I'm going to read it in its entirety. Your belief that you are better than others is sheer ignorance. Rather, you ought not to look at anyone without considering that he is better than you and superior to you. Thus, if you see a child, say, this person has never sinned against God, but I have sinned, and so he is better than I. If you see an older person, say, this man was a servant of God before me, and is certainly better than I. If the person you see is a scholar, say, this man has been given what I have not been given, and reached what I did not reach, and knows what I am ignorant of. Then how shall I be like him? If the man you meet is ignorant, say, this man has sinned against God in ignorance. Well, I have sinned against him knowingly. So God's case against me is stronger. I don't know what end he will give me and what end to him. If the man you meet is an unbeliever, say, I don't know, perhaps he'll become a Muslim, and his life will end in doing good. And because of his acceptance of Islam, something of his sins will be taken away, as a hair is taken from dough. As for me, God is our refuge. God grant that it doesn't happen, but perhaps God will lead me astray so that I become an unbeliever, and my life ends in doing evil. Then tomorrow he will be among those brought near to God, and I shall be among the damned. End quote. While Al-Ghazali does not explicitly mention the term humility in the above passage, humility clearly is the virtue he wants us to foster. Indeed, in his magnum opus, The Revivification of the Religious Sciences, Al-Ghazali finally identifies humility as, quote, the chief moral character. So, to sum up Al-Ghazali's thought on humility, humility is a type of courage which essentially involves self-reflection about one's relation to a fearful God and then to others in light of that relation. So, a quick comparison of Al-Ghazali and Avicenna's views of humility will provide the context for further thoughts on intellectual humility. First, both thinkers make self-examination essential to humility. To be humble, one must have a true and accurate appraisal of one's place and status vis-a-vis others. Consequently, on their views, while one may perform acts that appear humble on the outside, if there is not an honest reflection on one's own status, and then acting in light of that reflection, those acts would be only accidentally humble ones. Accidental humility might be comparable to getting a good score on an exam on which one simply guessed at every question. In this case, one is neither intellectually better off for the high score or the humble acts, nor in a position to teach or help others in the way that the truly humble person is. Second, while both men make humility a response to something external, they do so in radically different ways. For Avicenna, humility involves one's response to those inferior to oneself. In contrast, for Al-Ghazali, humility involves a response to one who is infinitely superior, namely God. Alternatively, we might say that for Al-Ghazali, intellectual humility involves a response to the truth. And indeed, the truth, El-Haq, is one of the 99 beautiful names of God in Islam. Taken this way, Al-Ghazali's theory of intellectual humility requires that one be committed to something called the truth, and that we humans have access to that truth. A third point of comparison, which follows upon this last one, is that for both Al-Ghazali and Avicenna, there are sets of beliefs that an intellectually humble person should simply never give up. In the case of Avicenna, these beliefs are the conclusions of demonstrations, while in the case of Al-Ghazali, it is the received word of God or the truth. Now, I mentioned this last point since today we might think that intellectual humility requires a fallibilist attitude. We should in principle be willing to revise or set down any one of our beliefs in light of new evidence. Now, indeed, most of us today, I suspect, and I include myself, are leery about the prospect of ever attaining a demonstration in the strong sense that Avicenna endorses. It's more difficult, however, to reject this condition, if we should, on Al-Ghazali's formulation with its tenacity of conviction to the Word of God or to truth. For if humility is a sort of courage, as Al-Ghazali believes, then intellectual humility may well involve holding some set of beliefs even in the face of strong contravening evidence. So let me conclude, and I really am very close here. Let me conclude by summing up what I consider to be two of the more salient, important elements for understanding intellectual humility that can be drawn from our medieval Muslim predecessors. These points concern the variable dimensions of a theory of intellectual humility. One dimension concerns the intellectually humble person's status with respect to others, while the second involves the intellectually humble person's attitude towards his or her own set of beliefs. Concerning the humble person's status with respect to others, the unquestionable assumption among Muslim ethicists is that humility, and perhaps the virtues more generally, is always a response to another. There simply are no humble solipsists. Actually, that should be their singular, solipsist. The other individual, however, might refer to something greater, that other individual, however, might refer to something greater than ourselves, as in Al-Ghazali's theory, or to humans, as in Avicenna's account. Obviously, if the response is to something greater than ourselves, then a recognition of one's low status is essential to humility. In contrast, if the response is to other humans, then it's an open question whether the humble person must essentially view him or herself as lower, or as equal, or even perhaps as superior. Thus, I leave this point as one that an adequate theory of intellectual humility should address. I'm not going to tell you what to think there, but I'm saying that's something that we should think about. The second dimension concerns beliefs. It seems that any theory of intellectual humility in some way must involve how one responds to beliefs. This response may involve how one acquires beliefs, or how one responds to the beliefs of others, or even what attitude to take towards one's own beliefs. Now, concerning how we should respond to our own beliefs, both our Muslim predecessors and we today can agree that the intellectually humble person should be willing to set aside pride, misinformation, ignorance, and the like. The humble individual should revise at least some of, and even perhaps most of, his beliefs in light of strong contravening evidence. So the issue then is a demarcation one. First, are there certain beliefs that an intellectually humble person should simply never give up, or should all beliefs be subject to revision? Seems a question that we need to ask about intellectual humility. Second, if there are some inseparable beliefs, which ones are they? Do they have certain hallmarks, or is it their place and function in one's larger belief system that makes them inalienable? Now, I don't pretend to have answers to these questions, but they do seem to be the sort of issues that an adequate theory of intellectual humility should address. And with that, I humbly conclude.